the chamber has allowed the accused to make a statement pursuant to Rule 84 bis today during the first session. Yes, Mr. Karadžić, you have the floor.
Good morning, Your Excellencies. Good morning, everyone. Today, I will be addressing you as the accused, not as a self-presenting defendant, as before. I am a physician, a psychiatrist, a psychotherapist, group analyst, and a literary man. Instead of being accused for the events in our civil war, I should have been rewarded for all the good things I've done. Namely, that I did everything in human power to avoid the war, that I succeeded in reducing the suffering of all civilians, that the number of victims in our war was 3 to 4 times less than the numbers reported in the public, that I proclaimed numerous unilateral ceasefires and military containment, and I stopped our army many times when they were close to victory, that I constantly sought peace and accepted 4 out of 5 peace agreements, that I advocated, initiated, and implemented the humanization of the conflict by applying all measures of humanitarian nature, that in addition to my many presidential duties, I personally supervised the supply of humanitarian aid, ceasefires, and the honoring of international law of warfare. And thus, I was the address for many successes of humanitarian actions. Also, I proclaimed and implemented many acts of mercy. As time passes, this truth will be stronger and stronger, and the accusations and the propaganda, the lies and hatred will get weaker and weaker. I never had anything against Muslims or Croats. On the contrary, I became a Sarajevo man of my own choice. I arrived in Sarajevo when I was 15, although all my countrymen went to Belgrade. And although in Belgrade I had my father's sister and other family, I chose Sarajevo of my own will. I got married there. My wife Liliana and my children Sonia and Alexander were born there. I was friends with the people of Sarajevo, making no distinctions, and I was friends with them deeply and sincerely. All my colleagues in psychiatry, my friends, my dentists, my tradesmen, my lawyers, all of them were Muslims. I never made any discrimination. My hairdresser of many years, Karadžić, is a man I visited a few days before the war started, hoping that there would never be a war, and I was always faithful to my choices. I never allowed for the possibility of even the smallest individual crimes, and especially not crimes on a mass scale, nor the possibility that any of the communities would be permanently removed from the Serb territories. Neither I nor anyone I know could ever think that there could be a genocide against any people that we believe to be the same as us, Serbs, although of a different confession. My other occupation is literature. I authored several books of poetry, including one of poetry for children. These books have been awarded by many prominent awards, and my poems have been translated into several great languages. After leaving my presidential duties, I also wrote one comedy and one novel called The Wondrous Chronicle of the Night. I was active in politics until 1968, from 1968 in fact, and after that for decades I was a dissident, and beginning with 1990 until 1996 I was also active as a founder and the president of the Serbian Democratic Party of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and also as a member of the presidency of the Socialist Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then I was president of Republika Srpska. My wife and I were also active in a political movement led by a prominent Muslim woman. If it hadn't been for the creation of political parties, I would still be in that movement today, because I was otherwise not interested in politics. I was born on 19 June 1945 in a village called Petnica, not far from Šavnik, in present-day Montenegro. Until the Berlin Congress, it was Herzegovina, and that's why we felt so close to Bosnia-Herzegovina, because we thought of ourselves as Herzegovinians. My father was a tradesman, my mother was a housewife. My family on my father's side had monarchistic sympathies, whereas my mother was more on Tito's side. My father was active in the so-called liberation movement when the war started, but then the communists killed off the prominent elders in our family. Those are the well-known leftist inclinations, and at that time my father chose the Royalist army, which was later suppressed by Tito, and then my father came home. My father was very fond of Russian culture and Russian monarchy and parliamentarism. When after 1968 I stopped believing Tito, I was then 32. I was then 23, in fact. I came to see the rightness of my father's views. And until then, we argued a lot. I see in the transcript that he was fond of Russian culture. In fact, it was British culture and parliamentarism. In that army, the Royalist army, which was referred to as Chetniks, these Chetniks in my area did not have any conflict with other ethnic communities. They only had an ideological conflict with communists. In Montenegro, in my region, in Nikšić, there are Muslims who live there, even very close to my home, and they were very close also to my parents and our family. The Muslims of Nikšić are very renowned people, very prominent athletes, physicians, etc. And there had never been any interethnic conflict or any bad sentiment between communities. The Catholic Church was very close to my school, and there I came to love Bach, listening to the organ music. Therefore, my experience with the so-called others were more than good and favorable. And my father had a friend, as close as a brother, who was a Muslim, who was an Albanian. And I never had any bad experience of that sort, and that's why I chose to live in Sarajevo. In the 90s, the Serb community in Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1992 became very anxious when the HDZ appeared in Croatia and when the Izetbegovic made his announcement in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The Serbs were frightened of the Ustasha rhetoric, and there were also suspicions that Mr. Izetbegovic, the author of the Islamic Declaration, would apply this Islamic Declaration as a political platform of his party. There is not a single Serb or any man anywhere in the world who could convince Serbs that there is or isn't a threat of genocide. It is only when they saw where things were going in Yugoslavia that they understood what's the writing on the wall before I even said a word. The Serb party was established only after those two other political parties, the HDZ and the SDA, had been founded already, with their very strong anti-Serb political orientation. I was neighbors with Mr. Izetbegovic. We met very often, and my literary friends defended him in the former regime. They did not agree with the Islamic Declaration, but they didn't think that he should be in prison either. I often queried him about what his party was going to be like, and I had the most favorable impression of him, and I told my friends that this man could not possibly do anything that is written in the Islamic Declaration. And when it became clear that the Serb party had to be established, I informed Mr. Izetbegovic, but he already knew that from a certain Mr. Srebrovac, who had been in jail with him. And when I said that Srebrovac and myself would be together, he was kind of downcast. I don't know why, but he seemed glad that the Serbs would also have their own political party. He asked me that the Serbs should not vote for communists among their community because it was customary for people in one community to vote for the worst people in the other community. So he asked me that Serbs should not vote for Muslim communists. Mr. Izetbegovic was very concerned that the communists would remain in power and that he and his group would perhaps end up in jail for the third or fourth time. I agreed, and we did not vote in the way he feared. We voted honorably. And my agreement with Mr. Izetbegovic was that if we win at the next elections, every community could vote from any of the four ethnic lists. And that still applies in the federation. One voter can vote either from the Croatian and Muslim list, and if it had been so, there would be no problem. Mrs. Plavšić received many votes from Muslim women. We were able to see that. Quite simply, those Muslim women were happy to see a woman on the presidency, and we saw a light at the end of the tunnel, a possibility to live well together. However, despite all the resistance that I felt, I had to become part of the presidency, although I had been refusing to be nominated to the parliament or the presidency, and I said that after the elections I would return to my profession, which is physician first and author next, and I would not be politically active.
Ja mislim, bojim se da prevod i da transkript nije dobar. Ja sam...
I'm afraid the interpretation is not correct. I refused to be nominated and I did not become member of the presidency or the parliament. My determination was to remain physician and author.
Svi koji me znaju...
Everybody who knows me know that I am not an autocrat, that I'm not aggressive, that I am not intolerant. On the contrary, I'm a mild man, a tolerant man with great capacity to understand others. But it is true that I was strict towards myself and others in implementing democratic decisions. I did not abuse the great powers given me by the status in the party or the great powers given me later by the constitution in Republika Srpska. Immediately after the elections, tensions rose in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and our pre-electoral idyll was ruined because the Party of Democratic Actions, the SDA, which represented the Muslim community, changed its main orientation in favor of Yugoslavia already in the end of January. In mid-January we established the authorities, and in end January the SDA chose secession. In establishing the authorities, the Serb side, the SDS and myself, made many concessions to keep peace in the house. In numbers, we were almost equal to Muslims, if we take Serbs who declared themselves as Yugoslavs. However, Croats and Muslims got the most prominent posts. The Muslims got the post of President of Presidency, a Croat became the Prime Minister, and the Serbs had to satisfy themselves with getting Speaker in the Assembly. However, there were also ministries of power, the Ministry of the Interior and the Ministry of Defense were given to Croats and Muslims. Even the Foreign Ministry came under the control of a Muslim, namely a man whom we knew would take Bosnia in the direction of fundamentalist regimes instead of the direction of Europe. Then came a period of underhand dealings and blockages in establishing the authorities. The Serbs could not get the posts that they were promised. A Serb could not become the head of MUP. Marginalization started. A period of peacetime underhand dealings and trickery, and we could live with all that still, but we were very concerned about manipulations with the MUP. The MUP became one with the Party of Democratic Action. The SDA sent its members for military training in Croatia with the intention that these people, upon return, be integrated into the MUP and into that army of the Republic that was in the making already on the 30th of March. On the 10th of June, the National Council for the Defense of Muslims was already established. Some people who were convicted were also included in this, people who had been convicted many times before, and all of that presented a great danger to us. What the Serbs had lived through in areas where there were less than 50%, such as Visegrad, for instance, for the entire year, not a single community in Europe would put up with that, with the humiliation, even rapes, even murders. If I tell you that on his patron saint's day, a Serb would invite a Muslim and play good host, you know what the patron saint's day means for a Serb. And after that, the same man kills him on the doorstep of his own home. It is not individual pathology. This man obviously thought that it could be done. That was the case with the killing of the member of the wedding party on the 1st of March 1992. The father of the groom was killed and some other people were killed, but this was not done by one of those cellos. He said it on television. He said that goes nowadays. In every municipality, in every area where we live together, the military organizing of Croats and Muslims was no secret to anyone. We could see it. It was obvious.
Arming and the similar problems, when I discussed that with Mr. Izetbegovic, what was happening among the people, he would simply shrug his shoulders and say, well, everybody is arming themselves. It was clear that we were headed towards a catastrophe. We simply made political movements. We were relying on the constitution, on the local self-government, and we were aiming for regionalization. Mr. Izetbegovic, of whom I still think positively because I believe that he was pushed into the war, he suggested to us at the end of May '92 to split Bosnia. We were shocked. He gave that proposal to Mr. Zulfir Karpašić as well. He did it at least twice, and Mr. Zulfir Karpašić wrote about that. We clearly stated that we were against the division of Yugoslavia, against the division of Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Croats accepted the idea, and then somebody came up with an idea to exchange populations. We branded that a nightmare and rejected that idea as well. Following that, the Zagreb Daily Večernji List published an idea on cantonization of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Mrs. Plavšić, on behalf of the Serb community, stated that it was an interesting idea, letting them know that we did not reject outright such peaceful suggestions. So all of the political movements we made at the time were made in, so to speak, dire straits when we were pushed into a corner. We were pushed into a corner by the movements of our partners in government and by our neighbors in two other ethnic communities, and we were forced to do that. Those were the things we had to do from the founding of the party until the war broke out and until the end of the war. Throughout that time, our reactions and my personal reactions were aimed at minimizing the damage and doing what we had to do under the circumstances. The president of the Muslim Bosnian organization, the second Muslim party, Mr. Zulfir Karpašić, one day in the summer of 1992 called me on the phone. I was about to go on a trip when he told me that we had to get together to save Bosnia and to conclude a historical Muslim-Serb agreement. I canceled all of my other engagements and gladly accepted to meet with him, gladly accepted the idea presented to me, and it seemed to me at the time that Mr. Izetbegović also genuinely accepted that idea. We were expected to give up on the idea of regionalization and to keep Bosnia in its entirety in Yugoslavia. Upon return from America, Mr. Izetbegović discontinued his further support to that project, and starting in the end of August, there was an increase in tensions, and it was only then that we founded the autonomous region of Krajina. It was done by the local population, and nobody could really take it against them because there were several Muslim municipalities being established at the time, and the people in that region did not want to accept the domination of Sarajevo. Neither did they want to accept the domination of Pale throughout the war. They really wanted to have a sort of local self-government, which they wanted to ensure for themselves. Mr. Izetbegović once came back from Germany, and he looked quite beaten and discouraged, and he said to me and Mr. Koljević that he was being pushed into fighting for independence and that he had no other choice. Those were really, really difficult moments, and at the time it really seemed as though somebody was pushing him to fight for the independence. Throughout that period, even though we could observe that the Muslims and the Croats were organizing themselves in the military sense, the entire Serb elite, the intellectuals, members of the party, the leadership of the party, were against the SDS establishing a paramilitary formation, and the SDS never really had one. In all of the foreign intelligence services, there were speculations to the effect that perhaps Captain Dragan was a member of the SDS, but they could never claim with certainty that that was the SDS paramilitary formation. I myself and the entire Serbian political leadership didn't really know what attitude the JNA would take. At the time, the JNA had an identical attitude towards national parties. It was an ideological conflict, if I can call it that. And we had a great dilemma as to what to do should the war break out. Our young men were serving in the JNA, whereas their young men were under their control and under their command. So during that time, I was faced with a lot of pressure from the ground. Local authorities were quite concerned, justifiably concerned, because they felt abandoned by the federal government, they felt abandoned by their own leadership in Bosnia and Herzegovina. They were left to themselves to resolve a multitude of big and small problems. So, in turn, they pressured us. The only means they had at their disposal that nobody could take away from them was the territorial defense, which according to the law belonged to each local commune. And everybody not only could, but had to, under the law, defend their country once it was attacked. There was no way to betray that people. Nor could I have accepted something that they would not have accepted themselves, because it would have lasted for a very short time, only 2 hours. This is the nation that had a long memory, that remembered everything that had happened to them in the past, and there was no way one could dictate to the Serbs what they should be doing. So we had enormous pressure exerted on us because the people were afraid that they would all be massacred. And during that time, the Serbs were being killed. It is a terrible misconception, and it is a great injustice this portrayal of the Serbs as those who started the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The Serbs were exposed to the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina even before the 4th and 6th of April. A member of the wedding party was killed on the 1st of March, and then there was on the 25th and 26th of March, there was a terrible massacre in Brod and then in Sjekovac. On the 5th of April, or rather on the 4th of April already in Sarajevo, the Green Berets attacked the barracks, Serb communities, and they occupied all tall buildings, skyscrapers, put their snipers there. They killed policemen, they killed young people who tried to cross into Grbavica, which was already under Serb control. So that was the night of terrible terror in Sarajevo. So the beginning of fighting and the beginning of the war in various municipalities have nothing to do with me. At the time when these killings were committed in Brod, Bijeljina, Kupres, we still had the common state of Bosnia and Herzegovina. Mrs. Plavšić, Mr. Koljević, Mr. Simović, and others, Mr. Ostojić, they went to those hotspots on a task given by joint authorities to calm the situation. They were not sent there by the SDS. Simović was on our list, but he was not a member of the SDS. These people were tasked by the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the government of Bosnia and Herzegovina had among its members some Serbs. There were Serbs in the presidency, and people were sent on these tasks as representatives of the common joint government. On the 1st of March 1992, a member of the Serb party was killed in Sarajevo the day after the referendum. Mr. Koljević and I were in Belgrade at the time, so we were not responsible for the barricades. The barricades were a spontaneous, a chaotic reaction to the possibility that somebody could dare to kill a Serb in front of an Orthodox church, that somebody could dare shoot at the wedding party without there being any protection for that wedding party. We had no influence over the joint police. The police was controlled by the Muslims, by the Muslim SDA, by their extremists. And before our very eyes, it was transforming itself into the illegal army of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We ourselves were completely powerless. My escorts, who were policemen in the joint MUP, escorted my family in the 11th hour on the 5th of April outside of Sarajevo under fire. I was still myself in the Holiday Inn hotel in Sarajevo, and from there, together with two other national leaders, I went to the TV station where we were guests in a live TV show. We were trying to give our views to the audience. In front of that time, at that time, there were 50,000 protesters in front of Holiday Inn. Some of them were armed, and this is why my escorts did not allow me to go back to the hotel, even though I wanted to do that. However, two of my bodyguards remained there. They ended up being taken prisoner, mistreated. They barely managed to stay alive. We were also very concerned for the fate of Professor Bucha. However, it seemed that some smart people managed to get him outside before that enraged crowd broke into the hotel and started firing. So the only issue that I should be put on trial for is the social and political stupidity which came as a result of excessive trust that I had in people, and we and the Serb community in Bosnia and Herzegovina could have paid a very high price for this stupidity of mine. The first manifestation of war was the expulsion of Serbs from the towns where Croats and Muslims were in majority. In the parts of Bosnia and Herzegovina where the Serbs were a minority, they were fair game, perfect targets, and they never took to arms to defend themselves. And until September 1992, there was not a single Serb settlement in the Muslim and Croat Federation that was left intact. Everything had been cleansed, killed, set on fire. Quite to the contrary, in Republika Srpska, in what is today Republika Srpska, and at the time was part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we were in majority, there were no traces of war there at the time. Your Excellencies, there was no pattern of behavior in the Serb municipalities. If we look at the war in Bosnia and Herzegovina, in Sarajevo, and in the predominantly Muslim areas, we see that it was raging starting on the 5th of April, whereas in the neighboring Serb Rogatica, the war didn't start until the 20th of May. So it is clear that in the areas that were under Serb control, there was no war. The Serb side didn't start a war, and no war was started until the Muslims initiated it. Most of the municipalities in Republika Srpska saw war at the end of May. Those were the municipalities of Bratunac and Vlasenica, which already had reached an agreement on creating two municipalities and having a peaceful coexistence there. Mrs. Rabia Shubakovic, an eminent Muslim, wrote an open letter to Izetbegovic asking him to support this sort of a project in other municipalities as well. And instead of supporting her, an order came out ordering the Muslims in Bratunac and Vlasenica to start shooting. And those two municipalities were turned into a slaughterhouse. And it was not a result of any will of mine. I did not know about this. This came as a result of negotiations and the attack of arrogant extremists from the SDA party. This is how it was in the Krajina municipalities also, where despite the fact that there was a war in other Bosnian municipalities, no war broke out in Krajina municipalities until it was initiated by the extremists. Until that time, they had their own police, they had their own cooperation, and life was going on similar to how it is regulated nowadays in the European Union. And the cooperation ended at the end of May at the order of the SDA, which we could hear from one witness, based on their strategic interest to ensure that the left bank of the Sana River were annexed to Cazin and Bihać. So they started from the Sana River and its left bank.
Ja nisam imao uvid u to.
I didn't know anything about that. I learned about all that only later. We did not have any reliable communication lines with Krajina for a few months. Not only because there was no corridor, or the corridor was broken off. The corridor was actually stabilized towards the end of the year, but that was not the only reason. Another reason was the fact that we didn't have even telephone lines. The valley of the Sana is comprised of Kluč, Sanski Most, Prijedor and Bosanski Novi. Those four municipalities were torched towards the end of May and the beginning of June. And that was all based on the strategic interest which was for that area on the left bank of the Sana River to be annexed to the Tsazin Krajina. Although we did not have any communication lines over there, we didn't have any contacts there, the autonomous region of Krajina had its parliament, its government, its ministers. They tried hard. The Krajina people had always been of autonomous views. The Serbs want to be autonomous wherever they are. We had our reliable people over there, for example, the president of the assembly, Mr. Kupreshinin, on my behalf and on his own behalf, toured remand prisons. He helped the prisoners there. He cooperated with the UNHCR, the International Red Cross, the local Red Cross. He alarmed the general public about the possible peril that threatens the civilians. He went to Manjača, he went to the prison in Prijedor. He wanted to help, he wanted to diminish the sufferings. However, there were no prisons anywhere before Prijedor came under attack. The prison was an investigative center because the remand unit or the detention unit could only hold up to 10 people, not more. And then, on the 30th of May, there was a large-scale attack on Prijedor, which resulted in the arrest of a large number of people. 59% of those people were released immediately after the triage process was completed. Those prisons were not camps. Those prisons existed only for as long as the investigative judges were there and the investigators, and they worked every day. They worked hard. As soon as all the investigative actions and the triage were over, 41% of the people were sent to Manjača because they had participated in fighting. And some were also subject to criminal proceedings, and the rest were released. In other words, there were no prisons before the war, before the clashes, and there were no clashes before the end of May. However, we didn't know even that. We didn't have any insight. We didn't have any way to learn about all that or make our mark. Srđan Srđić from Prijedor, he was the president of the Red Cross in Prijedor, also an MP. Whenever he could, he informed us what was going on, what was happening. He tried hard to inform us. And he gave me firm guarantees that there was no barbed wire around Turnopolje, but I could only see that for myself subsequently. At that time, I was in London at a conference there. I personally invited British journalists to come. I spoke to Penny Marshall and her team, and I even transferred them on our government's aircraft. And I opened the Republika Srpska for them. I told them they could visit anything that they wanted to see. I encouraged them to take escorts where they wanted. If they didn't want, they didn't have to take escorts. I didn't want to hide anything. That was my first motive. And the second underlying cause was to have the presence of the journalists to curb the influence of some of the renegade elements amongst us. That was another one of my stupidities, because there is no country in the world who would let the journalists to the front line. But I can tell you that the journalists who introduced themselves as journalists to us did a lot more damage to us than NATO shells. For example, they would stage a scene where a man would be put next to the barbed wire, although he was not there previously, and then they took a picture of that and sent off that image to the world. Thomas Eichmann exposed that, and now it is very clear. However, at that time, this could not be denied. Every reader had seen that, so you could not go to every reader to explain that things were not what they seemed. We continued to attend conferences to discuss Bosnia and Herzegovina. All of our moves at that time were reactions to the Muslim side moves. It was only on the 16th of April that we set up our own territorial defense, because the Muslims had expelled us from their own territorial defense and they removed the Serb general. On the 22nd of April, I launched a platform and I suggested that nothing that had been taken by force should be recognized, because any further fighting from that would have been pointless. And all that time we participated in the conference on Bosnia and Herzegovina under the chairmanship of Lord Cutillero and Lord Carrington. And then the chairs became Cyrus Vance and Lord Owen. That was the continuation of that same conference. However, the war raged against our will. There was no way to influence the events. We took the decision on the setting up of our army on the 12th of May. But it was only on the 15th of June that we actually organized it or made the decision on its organization. We spent the entire year of 1992 in trying to structure the Army of Republika Srpska, and we went into great pains to turn common people into soldiers, and they fought only in the territory of Republika Srpska, and it was defense. All the time we defended ourselves. We never embarked on trying to conquer Muslim territories, because it was abundantly clear that there would be a division, i.e. the reorganization of Bosnia and Herzegovina into three different republics. And we had under our control over 60%. So I knew that it would be crazy to take even more territory that we would eventually have to give back. This put us into a very difficult situation where we had to passively defend ourselves. We suffered a lot of casualties, especially during the so-called truces, when we suffered more losses than at the time that we were actively engaged in fighting. The events in the municipalities followed a certain logic. Apart from Foča and Zvornik, everywhere else, and of course Bratunac, where already at the beginning of May Judge Zekic was killed. But that was 4 weeks after the 8th of May, after the war broke out in Sarajevo. So apart from Zvornik and Foča, and we did not know anything about these two, in all the other municipalities the war broke out much later. In Zvornik we didn't know what was going on there. We didn't have a clue. Nobody ever invited Arkan there. I don't think that he was ever there. Maybe some of his men were there. There were a lot of paramilitaries there. However, on the 16th of April, our police didn't know who was in control of Zvornik, and our police, the secretary from the ministry called Arkan on the phone and asked him who was in control of Zvornik. The same applied to Foča. The late Mr. Karadžić went there with Jeremy Braid in April to assist, to see what was going on with the Serbs who were left at the elements' mercy, and they almost killed them there. So that had nothing whatsoever to do with us. We could not influence any of those events. Now that I have mentioned my participation in conferences, Your Excellencies, many events, many incidents happened while I was abroad attending negotiations or meetings. I knew that things were not happening because I was not there, but because those incidents were staged during the conferences in order for the conferences to fall through. On the 20th of May, there was an explosion in Vasa Miskin Street. It is no longer in my indictment, but it is a very significant model. The ambassador Kutileva called me on the phone, and he told me that he had to interrupt the conference. We were in Lisbon at the time because a mortar shell, had killed people in a bread line. I took an hour's break in order to inquire with our army and the police as to what had happened, and they told me it was a nonsense. They told me we did not fire any shells. It was impossible to fire a shell in such a narrow street. They told me that the media had already been there, prepared to film an event, and then I was very certain that we didn't do it, and I told Mr. Kutileva that, and that he shouldn't buy that rubbish. That was a model that was followed when the other incidents in Sarajevo happened. Unfortunately, there were also crimes. For example, Karadžić Stijene, which was not staged by Muslims. It was committed by criminals. And I was also at a conference at that time. The army informed the state leadership. They informed me. I was shocked. I was angry. And I asked that the two presidents of the municipalities shed some light on the crime, to take measures. I shouted at some innocent people, especially the leadership of Senator Vakov, which is today's Kneževo. Srebrenica and Vlasinac and Bratunac and Zvornik. We were in a large room. There were about 20,000 armed Muslims there. We sent them messages that they shouldn't fight, that that area would be given to Muslims. However, we suffered losses. Workers were being killed, farmers in their fields, miners in the mines, they were all being killed. And we used all the roundabout ways across Sekovići and Capardići, but they would come even there. They would set up ambushes, they would kill civilians, they would stop buses and kill all the civilians there. They prevented us from having any sort of communication, and they rendered impossible the survival of Republika Srpska and the people in that area for an entire year up to the spring of 1993. We suffered all that. We didn't do anything, but then we had to launch a counter-offensive in order to neutralize them. Then we took Cerska, Konjević Polje, and so on and so forth, and it was then that we saw an unprecedented campaign about blood flowing in Cerska, about a huge number of people having been killed, although what we found there was houses torched and Serbs crucified after having been kidnapped. We found all sorts of things there. However, this story about the Serb crimes in Cerska was just a cry wolf, and one couldn't match that in the international media. If General Morion had not gone there to inspect the situation, the story would have held and it would go down in history as a genocide that had been committed by the Serbs. And then the families went to Tuzla, whereas the able-bodied men went to Srebrenica. It was their choice. They went to Srebrenica to fight there. We continued our activities. We proceeded with our actions. I stopped our army. Some of my generals understood that. Some were very angry. Common soldiers, foot soldiers, were very angry when I stopped our army at the very entrance into Srebrenica in 1993, because I knew up to then that 1,300 Serbs, mostly civilians, had been killed, and the soldiers were from those families, the families that had been killed. And the Ministry of Defense from some very big countries published their communique saying that we had entered Srebrenica and that there were again flows of blood on the street. That cannonade of lies and propaganda about the crimes that had been committed is similar to what happened after the fall of Srebrenica in 1995. The rhetoric was the same. The way things were represented were the same. And again, it was another cry wolf situation, but nobody could believe that. Your Excellencies, I trusted the international community. I often came at odds with our army. I attacked our officers for having done things which they didn't do, as a matter of fact. It turned out that I tended to believe rumors more than my own officers. And they were in dire straits. They were between a rock and a hard place. And so was I, because I tended to accuse them, attack them, because I believed the allegations, and most of them were simply not correct. One of the most common such misunderstandings, or rather the sources of misunderstandings between the civilian authorities and the army, was the issue of convoys. I had thousands of other concerns and worries. I had almost 2,000 kilometers of front lines, and although I was not engaged in tactical command, I was still concerned with the supplies for the army, the food supply to them, people who lived along the front line and how they lived. However, despite of all that, and despite of my engagement in the negotiations with the international community, I found time every time somebody asked me to help with the passage of a convoy.
We
have heard, and I assure you, that at any given moment there were about 700 trucks on the roads of Republika Srpska. There were times when Croats stopped humanitarian aid for Muslims, and the only ways sometimes for the humanitarian aid to reach Muslims was through Serb territory. However, there were many problems with the convoys. The problems arose due to the great number of trucks or goods that had not been declared, or because these transports appeared at checkpoints where they had not been announced, and the soldiers there did not know anything of these convoys. And still, in all those situations, we did our utmost so that civilians on the other end of the line would get the aid. This kind of assistance is a tradition that Serbs introduced from the Serb-Bulgarian War. And Ari Dinan, the founder of the International Red Cross, was aware of that. Every time aid came for poor people in Bulgaria, the Serbs stopped the fighting to let the aid through. Professor Karadžić, one of the greatest humanitarians and one of the best men I have ever known, was made ill by all his efforts to get the convoys through. And in those contexts too, I often accused unfairly our local commanders, because the Muslims, together with the humanitarian aid, received all the military equipment they needed. After every humanitarian convoy, we suffered many more losses because they received weapons, ammunition, and fuel along with the aid. And I had terrible difficulties trying to neutralize the rage of our people who saw for themselves that it was not humanitarian aid, it was military equipment.
I pored, kažem, svih tih poslova,
And despite my busy schedule, it never happened that I was too busy to respond to any invitation, any suggestion that we try to alleviate the situation and the suffering. Let's take Sarajevo. We were almost 200,000 in Sarajevo before we were expelled, and between 50 and 70,000 Serbs remained in Sarajevo. They were not allowed to leave. Sarajevo is my city. And any story that we would shell Sarajevo without any reason is absolutely untrue. Every shell that fell on Sarajevo hurt me personally. That was a city where I knew every square foot. But that city had over 2,000 legitimate military targets. And I proposed that Sarajevo be demilitarized. That was rejected. I suggested that it be placed under UN administration. That was rejected. They wanted, and they managed, to keep Sarajevo militarized to the maximum, with 50 to 70,000 troops inside, 3 divisions, 1 inside the city and 2 around the city. And they managed to ruin every ceasefire and to create incidents to feed the media, at the same time demonizing Serbs and keeping alive the hope of the Muslim leadership that somebody from the international community would get sucked into the war, involved in it on their side. Examples of this are incidents in Sarajevo. Mass killings and the suffering of people, including women and children, in lines for water, and especially Markale 1 and 2. It is shameless propaganda and tricks that produced the desired result during the war. But it is unimaginable that this is appearing now in the courtroom and that the court is verifying it as real events. The first incident, Markale 1, was staged after the 4th of February, when this attempt to orchestrate an incident with the humanitarian aid queue failed, and already some days later in February at an empty marketplace where there are no goods on sale. 500, 600 people are suddenly there, and this massacre is staged. I always asked our army to keep me informed, and you will see it in all the documents. I always said, please admit to it if it's our work. It will do less damage if we admit it, because we have to be credible. If we say something, it has to be true. And the army convinced me that it was not possible to hit such a place with one shell. There was no visual contact, and it was impossible. It was not even believable that 500, 600 people would be in such a small space. They had no reason to be there. And it was, on top of everything, impossible to create such damage in view of all the stalls and tables. It is a shameless orchestration. Obviously, some people got killed by that explosion, but we also saw android mannequins being thrown onto trucks, creating this show for the world. We resolutely rejected that, and we said that we would not accept any investigation unless the Serb side is somehow involved in it. The investigation was completed without us, and we were not allowed to do our own investigation. Now, as for Markale 2, Markale 2 was orchestrated in an attempt to take the crisis to its peak in May, and that attempt failed. And the strategic bombing that was supposed to change the balance of powers and to make us sign a surrender also failed. However, another opportunity was taken in end August 1995 by this orchestrated event known as Markale 2. Our side could not have fired that shell, nor could that shell hit that spot in that way. However, again, we were not allowed to take part in the investigation. Some investigating authorities from the international community cooperated with the Muslim police and harmonized their findings, although they should not have done that. So we were in a situation when there was nobody unbiased there who would be able to say what was actually going on. Muslims enjoyed such support in this trickery that we were helpless. We could just stand by and watch this catastrophe in the making without being able to do anything. Markale 2 is a glaring example. Again, there was an explosion there, some people were killed, but there were also bodies there that had never been on the market before the explosion. Some were brought from the front line, and also some bodies of people who had died of natural causes were brought from the morgue and added to the number of casualties. All of this was done to create this image of catastrophe and suffering. Now, speaking of sniping, I was always horrified by sniping because I believe it to be inhumane, although it is a legitimate military technique of eliminating important personalities on the side of the adversary. We in Sarajevo were not able to distinguish by appearance who was Serb, who were Muslim. We are of the same race. and there was no reason to engage in any intense sniping activity. I myself worked on many anti-sniping agreements, some of which were signed, but not many were implemented, not many were honored. Along the front line in the city of Sarajevo itself, Muslims were in a more favorable position in terms of range than us. They had positions on top of the highest buildings. They hit and sniped wherever they liked. They killed our young girls and women. They also shot people, and they employed champions in marksmanship to do this. Incidents around the Vrbanja Bridge, they presented as Serb activities, although that was automatic fire that went on all day. They engaged in this kind of trickery and crime that could be exposed only by a totally unbiased, impartial observer group, but that was sadly missing because all members of the international community there came with enormous prejudice against the Serbs, and there was no way for us to get our truth across, to make it see the light of day. We were completely trapped. Nothing that we did around Sarajevo was ever accepted. We never cut off any water, electricity, or gas. It was they who fired at the transformer station and cut off water. But they never had any shortages of water. They only had shortages of power. Water was in our hands. They sold water on the black market, and those who were engaged in this trade simply did not want water to be available free of charge.
Za modifikovane aviobombe sa
Concerning modified air bombs, I heard very vaguely that they are being researched, that they are being fitted with engines from some rockets, and that they were being tested at the grounds of the Army of Yugoslavia to make new firing tables for them. Nobody was required to ask me for permission for any innovations or modifications in the army, and nobody asked me. But this is another aspect of command, the military tactical aspect into which I never interfered, with which I never interfered. But I never heard that such a bomb was ever used in a populated area. I heard it was used to crush bunkers on mountains, or perhaps somewhere in the military industry, but not that it was ever used in a populated area. There was never any piece of news believable to any degree about that. As for Srebrenica 95, I was not involved in tactical and operative command or control, but whenever I passed through a place where there was some sort of command, especially a corps command, I stopped by to greet those people. And that's how I stopped by Vlasenica before the operation in Srebrenica, sometime on the 25th or 26th of June. And by that time, we were several days into the horrific Muslim offensive around Sarajevo, and Nasser Orić's forces stretched our forces thin and cooperated with the forces in Srebrenica. I need not remind you what this protected area looked like. It was a military ground for excursions of Nasser Orić's forces, who avoided conflict with the VRS. They terrorized civilians. They gouged their eyes out and tore off their ears, only to come back to the safety of the protected area after that. I gave my approval to a small-scale operation to separate Srebrenica and Žepa, to narrow it down to the urban core, as agreed. And that operation was supposed to separate and cut off this corridor between Srebrenica and Žepa that was used for the transport of military equipment and weapons. On the morning of the 9th, the Muslims decided not to defend Srebrenica, and the local leadership asked Sarajevo to let them surrender Srebrenica and let the population evacuate. The same day, General Karadžić asked for instructions because he was able to enter Srebrenica, and he wanted the opinion of the superiors. I gave our approval. By that time, I had stopped our army many times. Our army was called Stop and Go. We did not want to win. They wanted to win. They wanted to have all of Bosnia for Croats and Muslims. We did not want that kind of victory. We didn't want all of Bosnia for ourselves, and that's why we were not in favor of war. War was not in our interest. I gave approval to enter Srebrenica. The only civilians we expected to find in Srebrenica were Muslims. There was not a single Serb there. I ordered that these Muslims be protected, that all the facilities be protected. I ordered that a police force be established immediately to protect civilians. I knew that some of the refugees would probably want to go elsewhere, but it never crossed my mind that the entire population would want to leave Srebrenica. To us, it came as a complete surprise. Ambassador Akashi told me that the place was packed, that they were not allowed to leave, that they were not allowed to leave, but it was because their leadership didn't let them leave. It was not us. We did not receive any information about mistreatment of civilians. I did not receive any information of even individual murders in Srebrenica. I got reports of high tensions in Bratunac, where there were a lot of prisoners and very few troops, because Bratunac brigade was outside of Bratunac. And elderly military conscripts and young boys were guarding a lot of prisoners. It was not the only time when we had a lot of prisoners. There were many situations during the war when we had prisoners under our control. It was the usual procedure: capture, triage, and separation of those who were not subject to prosecution and who are sent to exchanges, and the others who were subject to prosecution. We sometimes effected exchanges directly on the front line, or we would send prisoners, the second group, to camps such as in Batković or prisons, and then on they would be exchanged. Never once during the war was there any situation where we would interfere in a normal situation where prisoners were treated normally, and And as soon as they reached Batković or another prison, they were available to the International Red Cross and everything was all right. Those were neighbors taking each other prisoners, and there were sometimes exchanges even before they ever reached Manjača or Batković. Personal contacts were used to organize these exchanges immediately, and the usual procedure was to send prisoners to Batković and then organize large-scale exchanges.
Svojim aktima
Very frequently, I showed, I pardoned numerous such individuals, and the rest were intended for exchange. They were never subject to any criminal prosecution. There was no indication that anybody was killed in Srebrenica or after that. I never once received any piece of information concerning that, be it verbal or in writing. Those were the same types of rumors that we experienced in 1993 in relation to Cerska and later on in relation to Srebrenica. And one did not need to trust that or to verify that, because I would have once again come into conflict with the army, having accused it groundlessly for the umpteenth time. When Mrs. Albright came across a body on a surface, on a flat surface, I ordered that it be investigated. I went on the 22nd or 23rd of March to the main staff, and I told the main staff that we should not put up with that propaganda any longer, and that the presidency and I myself would order that the most detailed investigation of every single death in and around Srebrenica be investigated. Nobody from the main staff opposed that idea. Everybody agreed with me and accepted it. And after that, I issued an order to the army, to the police, to the military prosecutor, and everybody else concerned to investigate every single death in and around of Srebrenica. Unfortunately, in mid-May, that is to say 5 weeks later, I transferred my authorities to Mrs. Plavšić, and I could no longer follow the situation concerning those events.
u isto vreme ja sam pored onih
At the same time, in addition to those existing 2,000 kilometers of front, I was given an addition in the mileage with the addition of the front in Western Slavonia. There were numerous municipalities falling one after one. Bosansko Grahovo, Glamoč, Drvar, and Bosanski Petrovac were at risk, which were almost entirely Serb municipalities. Also Mrkonjić Grad with a dominant Serb majority, and there was no reason or anything else to raise the flag, indicating that something else had happened. What we saw were the fireworks, were the rumors that we had witnessed back in 1993. So at the time, there was no information about it. I did not learn about it until I came here, where I learned about things that happened. Your Excellencies, the Serb local authorities are the model of caring authorities. Nobody was ever armed in those municipalities until there was an attack. The Serbs always offered that there be two parallel structures of authorities, that everybody take care of their own people until there was a final solution. Why would you want to expel somebody if you gave them premises, to have their own police, to have their own municipal authorities in a building right next to you. It never occurred to us to do that. Nor did we want to recognize any fait accompli. We expected that there would be final negotiations at the end. On the 24th and 25th of January 1992, I said in the Parliament of Bosnia and Herzegovina, if we continue down this road, we will have a religious and ethnical war. The Serbs will go to Serb municipalities, the Croats to theirs, the Muslims to theirs. There would be mass murder, there would be blood flowing, and in the end we will have to sign an agreement and have three homogeneous ethnic communities. And this is exactly what happened. I offered that we wait with holding a referendum, to wait for the government to be restructured. Cengić accepted that, and the Serbs were supposed to go to the referendum and to legitimize it. We were in an impossible situation. I personally was in an impossible situation because I was exposing my community to danger because of the concessions that I gave to the other side, because of my peace-loving policies. There was no such example of any other side going to war under so much pressure, faced with so many lies, and against enemy who was much stronger. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the mobilization ratio was 2-to-1 in favor of Muslims and Croats. And once the NATO and everybody else got involved, the ratio was even much, much worse. There is no such example anywhere in the world of that, and nobody ever thought of saying, let us hear the other side. Gentlemen, the truth is on our side, and it will only grow stronger. We did everything in our power to avoid the war and to minimize the consequences and damages. There is no statute of limitations that will run out on that, and lies are subject to statute of limitations, and we will live to see it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Karadžić. We'll have a break for half an hour.
All rise, please, releve.